Welcome everybody. I'm Jezeph. I lead MMC for Homes England, and welcome to this session on developing high quality temporary accommodation and affordable housing at pace using modern methods of construction. MMC will be talking about funding streams for housing with colleagues from MHCLG and the LGA, talking about the Affordable Housing Programme at Homes England, Romford Land Release Fund and the Local Authority Housing Fund. We'll then be going on to speak with Tracy Curley, the Chief Executive of Ashford Borough Council, about Fortis House. That project finished a couple of weeks ago, so a very recent project. Then we'll be talking to Norwich City Council and Broadlands Housing Association and St Martin's Housing Trust about Webster Court, a project that was built during the pandemic a couple of years ago now. And then we'll be talking to the YMCA and Rochester Harbour Architects about their projects in Mitcham and Romford, before wrapping up with a lessons learned session from two London boroughs, Lewisham and Tower Hamlets, followed by a Q&A at the end. Not everybody that was involved in the earlier sessions is able to stay for the Q&A sessions, but there's hopefully colleagues representing every single project. So hopefully we'll be able to field all the questions that you may have. First, we're starting with an overview of funding streams. I'd like to welcome Richard Birch from MHCLG to introduce the Local Authority Housing Fund. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Edward. The Local Authority Housing Fund has been running for a couple of years now. We're now on the third round of the fund. We announced earlier in 2024, and the objectives of the fund are to deliver homes for use as better quality temporary accommodation and also to support Afghan resettlement. Funding allocations have been made to local authorities, and agreements have been signed and delivery began in the autumn 2024. For this round, there is a new supply uplift where we offer a 10% uplift to grant rate for those local authorities who indicated in delivery plans that they wish to deliver some units as new supply. New supply, we count brand new developments, also include conversions of commercial property and also MMC. Whilst delivery plans have been set, if your new supply targets have changed, please do get in contact with us. Whilst there isn't any additional funding available at the moment, if there was to be any in the future, we're keeping a log of any requests.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richard. Now we're moving over to Paul.
Okay, thanks. Paul Brisson from the One Public Estate team. The Brownfield Land Release Fund is undertaken as a partnership between the Local Government Association and the Cabinet Office. It's administering the Brownfield Land Release Fund on behalf of the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Urban Government. The 3-year programme has provided up to £180 million to councils, and the focus has been on council brownfield sites, so land that's owned by councils. It can include disused buildings, underutilised land, car parks, anything which basically could be repurposed to deliver housing for the council. But the key bit is that it's in ownership of the council. The funding is to cover upfront costs, so it may well cover things like demolition, site remediation, groundworks, access and highways and utility upgrades. So the aim of the programme is to basically de-risk land, enable councils to then come forward with housing on that site. The key bit for us really is that the council will release the land for housing within 3 years of us providing that funding. So the key bit is really they would either dispose of the land, they could pass it to their own local housing company, or they could make a physical start on site if they're actually building it themselves. Whichever one of those triggers, that needs to happen within 3 years. The key bit really is, so both Brownfield Land Release Funds and previous programmes, it's awarded just over 300 million now, just shy of 10,000 homes land has been released for, and there's an additional just over 18,000 to be released by the end of March 28. The key bit for me in terms of modern methods of construction is that part of our eligibility is to encourage innovation. So that would include innovations in terms of better insulation, better building reg standards, better design quality, but it also includes MMC. And we are encouraging councils to look at and explore opportunities to deliver the homes using modern methods of construction. And a review of projects that we have funded to date would suggest that there's probably just over 2,000 homes that are coming forward with councils exploring MMC. The next few slides are just a few examples. So we've got St Andrews, which is in mid-Devon. They're factory built units and they're zero operational carbon. So really well insulated and using low energy heating systems. It also shows a council that's delivering affordable housing for rent. So they're investing in their own land, delivering affordable housing and using an off-site manufacturer. So there's projects in Sunderland with Town, and that just shows the opportunity to support SME, MMC providers, so small and medium enterprises. Next one looks at just how a council is looking to release a fairly large site using off-site manufacturing, particularly focusing on the upcoming industries around the north of the country and how that can be supported. So providing a pipeline of sites. That's it from me.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. Are you able to give any indication of how the grant is structured?
Yes, we both work with councils to look at how the scheme stacks up from a viability point of view. So it's looking at a development appraisal, looking at what the actual gap is in scheme. If we're able to cover the full gap, then that's great. But obviously there are value for money parameters that we have to work within. But if there's a need for additional funding, that's where we work collaboratively to see how that gap can be plugged from a range of funding sources.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Right, now over to Michael.
Hello, thanks, Ed. I'm Michael Wilson from the Affordable Housing Grants team at Homes England. The current programme runs up until 2026, 7.4 billion grant launched in September 2020. The programme is predominantly focused on new supply, but where additionality could be found, and also looking at some regeneration. And then recently in the government's autumn budget, that an additional 500 million was announced for the programme. So this is continuation of the existing programme on current grant terms. The AHP includes a strategic priority around MMC, how homes are constructed, and a significant portion of schemes that come forward are now using those technologies. The tenure of homes supported, so the affordable housing tenures could be rented or home ownership. We look to affordable rent, which is 80% of market, and also social rent as well. The type of home supported through the Affordable Homes Programme is that homes would be long-term provision. We look to the regulator of social housing's rent standard and tenancy standards as the baseline. And there's an expectation that tenancies for general needs accommodation would be for a minimum of 5 years, or by exception, 2 years. So this is intended to be homes for people to live in long term. We do, through the programme, also support specialist and supported housing, which may have different terms of occupation as well. Also, alongside the HP, we support a range of bespoke specialist programmes, and there's a few displayed on the screen now. These funds are all now fully allocated and either completed delivery or in the final stages of delivery. The current programme can be accessed through two main routes. So there's a continuous market engagement route, which is the traditional bidding. Schemes can come forward on a scheme-by-scheme basis. And this is suitable for registered providers as well as local authorities. And it's where we would support the majority of the specialists and supported housing. So we work with around 200 partners through this route. And then the other route is strategic partnership. So working with a range of large providers who have a development background, who are able to deliver at scale.
So now let's move on to a brief discussion. One of the key things that I've spotted is that sometimes some of these funding streams are used together on a project. And I imagine that sometimes that's not possible. So it'd be good to have an understanding of when and where that's possible. From what I've seen affordable housing program funding being supported by Brownfield Land Release Fund projects as well. But I'm not so sure about LAHF because previous rounds have been less focused on new delivery, whereas the latest round is focused on the new housing delivery. Richard, perhaps you can give us an insight about your understanding of how LAHF funding could sit alongside some of the other grant funding options available.
Yeah, of course. So LAF funding, you can't combine the grants with the HP grants, but you can certainly use the funding to contribute onto sites that are being developed through other funds. And I think, especially for the kind of Brown Fund side of things, there's definitely a good opportunity there for kind of units funded via LAF to be bought from those sites. LAF is a relatively small scale fund in comparison to certainly the AHP. Where councils may have done this in the past, you're looking at one or two homes within a larger site being purchased or funded for LAF use, with the majority for the wider affordable housing programme or other social housing investments by councils.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. So the other question that I wanted to cover was, Michael covered the fact that the affordable housing focus on tenancies of 5 years generally, 2 years on exception. My understanding is that the temporary accommodation, that the LAF's funds can consider shorter term arrangements than the affordable housing programme can do. And also the AHP is more those regulated rents that Michael talked about. Does that LAHF have those same restrictions?
Yeah, so on rent levels, we do expect that the rent charged is affordable or social levels. In terms of tenure types and tenure length, it's flexible depending on local needs. So councils have used a variety of different tenancy types, and length is entirely down to local needs. So with temporary accommodation, some councils are using quite short placements, and then where they're able to then move families into PRS or other housing. Whereas other councils, where housing pressures are particularly acute, will understand that actually a family is probably likely to remain in the LAF home for 1-2 years potentially. So there really is completely flexible to suit every council's particular needs. In the longer term, the aim for all of the LAF housing, whether the temporary accommodation or reassessment housing, is that this moves into the wider stock of social and affordable housing in order to provide that kind of long-lasting asset for the local community.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. Paul, are there any factors that we would need to consider on the same basis?
So in terms of Brentford Land Release Fund, the focus for us is on de-risking the sites and covering upfront funding, so demolition, etc. There are projects right around the country where we've worked with Homes England, who've then provided affordable homes funding into the scheme. We ask councils to very clearly say what other public funding has been committed to a project, and that impacts on benefit to cost ratios, value for money assessments, etc. As long as the value for money assessment still works and is above 1, which is the magic figure, then you can still have that cocktail. And particularly, it's important on regeneration projects, because key regeneration projects generally need a whole mix of funding to get them on site and homes being built. So we're part of the solution, and hence why we work hand in hand with Homes England and other partners.
Thank you, Paul, Richard, Michael, for joining us today, and thank you very much for your time. Next, we're speaking to Ashford Borough Council about Fortis House. Thank you very much, Tracy, for joining us today. If you could introduce yourself, that'd be fantastic.
Hi, I'm Tracy Curley. I'm the Chief Executive of Ashford Borough Council. Have been there as Chief Exec for about the last 9 years.
Today, we're going to be talking about Fortis House, a project that you've recently completed in Ashford. Could you give us a quick overview of the project?
As Ashford Borough Council, we've always been a council that's wanted to trial innovation and creativity. Part of our borough plan is that we're a green pioneer, and climate change is really important to us. There is a huge housing crisis on at the moment, and we need to deliver as much affordable housing as we possibly can. This site is an old brownfield car park site. It is very close to the town centre. It's very close to GP surgeries, bus services, all those sorts of community type facilities that people will need where they're in to move on accommodation from temporary housing. It's in the floodplain, so it is built on stilts, and a lot of flood attenuation work was carried out to the site to make it suitable for construction and to prevent further flooding of the site. What it's really all about is local authorities taking that innovative approach. And absolutely, if we don't do that innovation and trying different methods of construction. So there's very few people out there that will do this work. So it takes courage of members to think this is the right thing to do. And as I say, it's very easy to be able to say no, but it's also a very big challenge to say yes.
It's a brownfield site. It was an underutilized car park in a flood zone. So you're starting with layers and layers of complexity. And then you decided to adopt MMC and Modular as well, because, that just wasn't enough. Or was that part of the solution to those challenges?
I think it was part of the solution to the challenges, to be honest. I think if we were doing traditional construction, we'd be thinking very differently and probably not even considering this as an appropriate site for development.
Wouldn't have taken it forward then, potentially. You would have had to rule that out.
Absolutely. I don't believe that our members would have taken through a traditional construction development on this site. That isn't to say that modern method construction is only used for difficult sites, because it shouldn't be. But I just wanted to sort of say that on a difficult site like this, it was perhaps an easier decision for members to take. And if it can work on a site like this, it probably can work anywhere.
Absolutely. So I understand the scheme is 23 units of move-on accommodation?
Yeah, that's right. It's 23 units, of which we have 1 beds, 2 beds and 3 beds. And what I would also say is the scheme is 3-storey, so it has a lift. So absolutely helpful in terms of good access. But it also has 3 specially adapted disabled units within the scheme as well. So it's a really good mix of homes that we've been able to provide within the scheme.
Excellent. We saw the project together. It was the first time I was seeing the project. I was certainly impressed by the quality of the sustainability, the energy efficiency, the level of insulation, triple glazing, lots of technology there to support that. So solar panels, air source heat pumps with MVHR. What motivated you to take it to such a high energy performance specification?
Well, our aspiration was to be zero carbon, and our aspiration was to reduce energy bills for those people that were going to be living in that accommodation. I think one of the most volatile costs for any young family, any individual, is the cost of energy at the moment. And the opportunity to reduce energy bills down to such a low level through using modern methods of construction, for me, is one of the best outcomes that you can achieve. And it's really good to see what excellent practice can do and make a difference to people's lives.
It's quite a trailblazing project for you.
Absolutely, it is.
Tracy, can you tell me a little bit more about temporary accommodation in your borough and the challenges that you have?
I have in the region of 250 people in homeless accommodation every night, and that is not acceptable. I hate the thought of young families having to live in bed and breakfast accommodation, having to sit there of an evening with their children trying to do their homework. Learning to live in effectively one room is just not good for any household, any family. So the more we can do of this type of accommodation, the quicker we can build it. And we haven't talked about speed of delivery, but these units came to site in February of this year, and we're talking about moving people in the next week.
The scheme, I understand, cost about £7.4 million. Can you give me a breakdown of how you funded that?
Yes, so it is an expensive scheme. It's about £320,000 a home. It's not the cheapest way, but it's all the added value that makes it worthwhile. And that's why I say it can be very easy to say no to a scheme like this. The costs are expensive, but the borrowing is done through the housing revenue account. That is funded on the borrowing costs to the council over a substantial number of years. We have taken grant from Homes England, which has helped enormously to make that a viable project. I think if we hadn't have had Homes England grant, then it might have been a more difficult decision for us to make.
And that came from our affordable housing programme, I understand.
Yes, it did.
Fantastic. Despite the perhaps slightly higher cost per home of this delivery solution and reflecting the challenging context, will the project be saving you money against your temporary accommodation costs?
Oh, without a doubt. That's 23 reduced costs in temporary accommodation every night. So, yeah, without a doubt. If I could have 3 or 4 more of these schemes, then I feel a lot more comfortable. But it's finding the right sites, it's getting through the planning process, all of which takes time. But actually the construction, when it comes to site, is quick and speedy. I've been to the factory at Peterborough, the ZPOD's factory. It's an amazing place.
They support the Prisoners Building Homes programme, don't they?
Yeah, it is an amazing programme that they are really giving prisoners in the local area some real life skills and qualifications as a result of this project. that when they come out of prison, and I think they use it in the last year of their sentence, when they come out of prison, they have some cash in their hand, they have a qualification, and they can get work because they're trained and qualified in the type of construction that they need in terms of this factory. As I say, it's not full of robots, it's quite labour intensive.
And I understand some of the money goes back to victims support as well. So there's
It does.
a lot of outcomes that are fantastic there.
And the reoffending rate of these prisoners is 0. So it's a really effective service for the judicial system.
Fantastic.
So it's a very nice scheme. These are mortgageable properties. I just need to emphasise that there's no compromise on the quality because they're a modern method of construction.
Indeed, they have a BOPAS accreditation, don't they? So it enables them to get that mortgage.
Yes, they do. We hopefully won't be selling any of those properties, but they are a good quality product.
Some of the spaces were double height as well, which was impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives them a really nice feel inside. Some of the ceiling heights are quite different in the top floor flats, and they look very attractive. Nice design.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about any lessons learned?
We need to think about the cost of what we've done and the cost of the scheme. We need to work on the lessons learned to see how we could have done things differently and learn from other people. If our building control officers were running the scheme, they've never done an MMC construction site like this before. Is that the right thing to do? Should we have specialist building control officers that understand the concept so it's not learning from the beginning each time a scheme like this comes forward? Just the project management generally, because the timings are so different.
A lot of the work's
Yeah.
done in the factory. So you've got to go see the factory, I think, in terms of doing your inspections and doing your on-site inspections as well.
These were manufactured in Peterborough and my building control officers are Ashford. We've got to trust each other, so we don't need to travel all the way up to Peterborough to see in the factory somebody else is able to relay that information to our building control officers with the same responsibilities and accountability. So it's those kind of lessons I think that need to be ironed out, Ed. And I think perhaps Homes England have a real role to help with this and play in how do we see modern methods of construction slightly differently from normal construction methods, and how do we make that journey that much easier for everybody who's hopefully taking on modern methods of construction in their authorities. This is the start of, I believe, a journey that we've got to stick with and go forward with.
Fantastic. And any other final remarks from you? Anything else you would like to mention?
Well, the one thing I'd just say is that I think it's an excellent scheme. I think that it's something that everybody should consider when they're looking at opportunities for construction in the affordable housing sector. It really makes a difference. I think that my biggest struggle would be, and it's a nice struggle to have, to make sure that when people move on from this accommodation, they know that they've got to budget for an energy bill, because their energy bills here are going to be so low that when they move on into more permanent accommodation, 2-3 bedroom houses, if that's possible, that they're potentially going to have an energy bill that they won't be used to. Nice challenge to have.
A real problem as you manage that transition, but that also speaks to
Yes.
the testament to the quality of this scheme and what Ashford achieves. Thank you very much for your time and for joining us today.
So thank you, Ed. Take care.
Welcome to this session where we're going to be talking about Webster Court in Norwich. If I could pass over to Andrew first to introduce himself.
Certainly, Edward. My name's Andrew Savage. I'm Exec Director of Development at Broadland Housing Association. We're a Norfolk-based housing association that operates right across Norfolk and East Suffolk.
I'm Jo Harrison. I help out the development team.
I'm Broadland Head of Development. I'm responsible for planning design stages.
Deb Gould, Senior Development Officer, Norwich City Council. So it was our land that was used for this project.
I'm Maria. I'm the Director of Homeless Services for St Martin's. My role here was about providing support into the project because the people were coming from a homeless sector.
Fantastic. So it was a brownfield site, an underutilised car park site.
It was the NSAP funding that Broadland applied for, supported by us as the local authority. We were aware that there was this piece of grassed area and parking adjacent to their existing properties, which was held in our housing revenue account. So it's land given over for housing and parking and general amenity. Broadland applied for the funding, supported by us, and once that was awarded, we then went to our cabinet committee to seek the disposal of the land.
What was the motivation and the decision to use Modular?
You've got to remember the time when this happened, Edward. So this was the NSAP funding. And this was when the call was to get everybody off the streets because of COVID. That funding had incredibly tight timescales on it. And the only way you were going to do that for new build, and I think the government, quite rightly, really wanted to see some assets there for long term rather than just buying houses off the open market. They really were encouraged to see some new builds. So we looked at the site. If you saw the site on plan, you'll see we come through quite a large residential area to get to this. Well, if you can imagine 25 white vans there for 12 months in that sort of location, it ain't going to quite work. We're going to annoy people even more. So we've done modular before. So Broadland is not new to modular. We're very used to building a timber frame. A light gauge steel, which has gone to 10 stories in Norwich on light gauge steels. MMC is not a new thing, but modular felt right because we needed a time scale. We were in COVID. We couldn't go and see anything. So what do?
The timescales is a very tight turnaround. We had confirmation of the funding award on 28th of September 2020 with a deadline for completion of the 31st of March 2021. So that's your motivation.
Yeah. And you delivered within that time frame?
No. So that comes to the next part of the story, really. And unfortunately, what we found at the time, we were procuring products from all over the place. The supply chains were weak, and actually that delayed a project. We were let down in terms of that.
Material supply chain.
The supply chain was poor. They were buying from all sorts of places and trying to put our specification into the unit as well. So not an easy thing to do, understand in the time, but actually it just showed how weak that supply chain was before it even started. Right. So I think, Ed, it took another 12 months, didn't it, after then, I think, before we actually got on site. Once we were on site, though, Edward, 3.5 days later, the thing went in, great specification. It's all worked very, very well. But it was that front end bit, that bit where we would expect a lot more engagement. So there we are.
Is that to do with the pandemic circumstances?
You've got to be relaxed about some of this, haven't you? Because, you've got the pandemic going on at the time. Once that building was on site, the speed of it, and it did what it did, it came off the lorry, the crane was there for 3.5 days, and actually the residents there found it fascinating. We had a complete turn of, oh my gosh, they're going to be gone in a minute. This is what they said it was going to do, which has got to be the positive. I'm trying to give a balanced view here, because it's got to give the positive of what went on. And with everything in place, very good eventually. But actually going through the process is where the time delays came.
In terms of the brick fab solution, it looked quite smart, and its quality must have been more expensive, and they kept the planners happy.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's pointless that we're going to go and do modular and then brick it up, because actually what we're doing is returning with all the vans that we're trying to stop and all the deliveries. It worked very well. In terms of cost at the time, we were okay. It was higher, and everybody talks about this. It was higher than traditional construction, but then we knew that. We wanted it for a different reason. But of course, the prelim costs for us just disappeared, really, in some respects. We did split the groundworks and the modular, so that's a good question for a lot of people, is how do you do that? So we have our local guys that we know very, very well here. That communication between the two didn't really happen properly, and that was disappointing. However, thank God we weren't too far out.
The accuracy of the
absolutely. I was petrified, I must admit, when that first unit went down on that ground. But it worked, and our local guys were really accommodating.
You touched upon financing and the fact it cost a bit extra.
I don't think we were much over 5 or 10% than traditional at the time, Edward. Remember, this is 2021. So when we're looking at that appraisal, we weren't paying any prelim costs. We've got literally the cost of the units, and there's a whole load of extra bits and pieces that you're not paying for that we would normally pay for in a contract. So actually, when you look at the whole thing, if you look to the build, yes, it's higher. If you look at the whole appraisal, then it's probably come in on par, which is quite interesting.
And you're paying more for the building, which is probably where you want the money to go, potentially.
Correct, because that means I'm more efficient, doesn't it? Because I'm getting better spec, I'm getting a better building, I'm getting all the better design on those modules. So it probably works.
Our portfolio and ward councillors were there for some of the installation when the modules are being delivered. And obviously huge supporters of the NSAP scheme. So it was very supported from our members. Yeah,
And they were pleased with the outcome?
absolutely. Yeah, had some fabulous feedback from St Martin's residents there.
Excellent. And Nuri, it'd be great if you could explain a little bit about the journey since and how the building's performed.
We work with Norwich City Council and Broadland will work together to look at nominations for the scheme. We've had some huge successes inside those properties. Really, really pleased with some of the outcomes. These were people who were coming from street homelessness. So they went from street homelessness, living in doorways and tents, into this beautifully furnished property, which Broadland had gone making these really homely properties. So they were just overwhelmed, quite frankly, when they went in.
That's good news.
What is the length of the tenancy they have there?
We started with 2 years, but then we started to roll those tenancies essentially. I think that they will probably go into general stock for Broadland and Norwich City Council in terms of how they're going to nominate for those tenancies going forward.
We really got up to speed really quickly on Webster Court. It was quite intense time, and if your planning department's not on board and you lose 2 months over a minor issue, there's no point in getting modular.
You know, it's a different risk profile because you've got groundworks, you've got modular. Everybody knows that interface. So don't underestimate that decision-making process before you start designing. Then you can design and have the fun. Because otherwise, what you end up doing is wasting a whole load of money, as we all know. You design something and then work out you can't build it. So you've got to research the market. And you might well, in the Midlands or north of England, find a modular supplier that actually fits that, or a timber frame supplier. So if that was my advice, plan.
Fantastic. Any other final kind of comments or recommendations?
Go for it, go for it.
If anybody ever wants to talk to us direct or see any of this, then they're very welcome. We're always open for people. If they just want to have a chat or whatever, then we can do that. All right?
Fantastic. Andrew, thank you very much. It's most generous of you.
No, it's an absolute pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Now we'll hear about 2 YMCA projects in Mitcham and Romford. Thank you very much for joining us. Richard from the YMCA delivered the YQ Mitcham project. I understand that a different YMCA branch delivered the Parkview Romford scheme a number of years later, but clearly inspired by what you achieved in Mitcham. So it'd be great, Richard, if you could just give us an overview of the genesis of the project and where it came from.
So for us, for YMCAs and for lots of supported housing providers, one of the biggest challenges we have is the opportunity for people to move on and to move into affordable and properties of reasonable quality as well. So we had a problem that we needed a solution, and it was through a conversation with RSHP. We found out they had a solution, which was around the modular units. So for us, the genesis was we created a prototype unit, which we based in Wimbledon Town Centre. We had people living it. We had our residents who allowed us to scope out how to use the unit in terms of furniture, layouts, storage spaces. And then from that, we then came up with the concept of the White Cube unit that went into Mitcham, which opened in 2015. And that was it, really.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Over to you, Harris.
I'm Harris. I'm an architect and digital lead at RSHP, Rochester, Carver and Partners. I've been involved in multiple modular housing schemes. I sit between the design and delivery team, and my role has been to establish the digital strategies that enable the delivery of these homes. The Y-Cube is a precursor to Parkview, and there's a lot of overlap between principles. They share a lot of principles in terms of their design and delivery approach. Y-Cube, 36 single studio homes, self-contained, stacked over 3 stories. The construction cost around 1.6 million. The team, YMCA, ACOM, and a team from SIG, who are now known as At Home. The concept behind YQ is trying to challenge the quality that we can achieve for affordable housing in England. These modules, 95% off-site, manufactured in and assembled in the facility, that allows the scheme to exceed current regulations in fire, acoustics, and thermal insulation. Very low tolerances can be achieved because of the controlled assembly facility environment that these homes are put together. So very well insulated, and they require little or no heating even in the winter months because of that air tightness. And of course, from a user comfort perspective, triple glazed full height windows to allow for ample light to come into these spaces. And the impact of this for the end user is essentially heating bills are 90% less than a traditional build. So a hybrid mix of mechanical and natural ventilation, which is providing efficient comfort year round for the tenants. Once the apartments are stacked next to each other, which maybe you can see on the plan here, all the cavities are also filled with insulation. It's really trying to find how efficient and high performing we can make these schemes. YCube accepts there's lessons learned that we'll see in the next scheme. Parkview is 39 single bed apartments built up to 3 stories. Construction costs 3.7 million. Very similar teams, so same client YMCA, but different teams within YMCA were involved compared to YCube, ACOM, and At Home, same assembly team for YCube. The scheme is called Parkview. The view of the park in front for the residents is what inspired the name. The concept behind Parkview was essentially it's a stepping stone option of affordable housing for people moving on from the main hostel, the main YMCA hostel that is located directly behind Parkview scheme, which means that the residents can continue to use the services and support from the hostel as well because of its proximity to the building. And just as with YCube, it's that plug and play concept. So these modules arrive on site, fully furnished and fitted with all the fixed fittings, making it very easy to connect to services once they arrive on site compared to a traditional method, and much quicker as well, of course. Construction period on site was 5 months. Underpinning these schemes is the way we leverage digital as a communication tool. It really enforces a collaborative approach to delivering the home. It's less of a baton passing exercise here, and it's really more about teams understanding how everyone within the design and delivery team works. So these fabrication level models really allow for reduced risk and increased cost certainty at a much earlier stage than you would typically get during a traditional process because of those components that are going into your buildings. The clear communication between the design, the manufacture, assembly and delivery teams of what's being procured and how intelligent models that can then produce your manufacture drawings. So for us as a practice, it's an evolution over 18 years at RSHP, and it's about taking the lessons learned from previous projects to try and improve and create better schemes for the next projects.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Harris.
In terms of the scheme, as Harris alluded to, the product is of really high quality. The affordability that we're able to deliver through the thermal efficiency means that people have got really low energy bills, which is really important. This was a pioneering scheme, the scheme in Mitcham. So creating the scheme, it took a lot of learning, and traditional funders initially weren't comfortable. We had sort of comments of what stops people coming in and taking units away in the nights. And you think, well, it's not quite like that.
Yeah.
So people pictured shipping containers and that kind of concept, and it took a long time to try and re-educate people in terms of this isn't about shipping containers stacked on top of each other. This is a very different solution and delivers a very high quality product. So knowing we had a really good relationship with the local authority in Merton, and it was that relationship that they were willing to go on a journey with us and look to pioneer something and to create something which was different. In the end, we required social finance is the way that we could only go about it initially. Then when the scheme was on site and people saw what it was, then traditional funding was able to replace the social finance. So that was a barrier for us, but then we overcame it. And then proof of concept led to what happened in Parkview and in other locations as well.
Fantastic. Clearly, the project's been around for 10 years now. So you have the evidence base of the performance of the building. So has it lived up to your expectations of those energy performance and durability maintenance?
Yeah, very much so. We was down there a few weeks ago, taking some other people around because people are still really interested in it. And it's a great scheme to take people to because it looks as good now as it did when it was finished 9-10 years ago. The people who are living there really value the cost of running their facility. The only issue we have is we wanted this to be a 3 to 5 year move on option. So people moving out of supported accommodation into their own place. But actually now where they now go, they're going, I don't want to go anywhere else. I really like this home. Why would I want to go into a shared home with kind of creaking doors and broken windows? So people really love it and they want to stay and not move on. So it's a good problem, absolutely.
Excellent. To touch on that financing point, I'd read that the Romford scheme, the Parkview scheme, had affordable housing grant from the Greater London Authority's affordable housing programme.
We did get Mayor of London funding for it. I think the funding was about £10,000 per unit, which was lower grant rate than some of the other schemes. The size of the YQ Mitcham units is 26 square metres. So they were designed before the mayor's size standards came into place. So we did do a prototype for a large unit, a sort of proof of concept. And so they can deliver within the confines of the back of a lorry at the larger unit scale. And then that qualifies for affordable housing grants.
How was the planning and the local community and local authority kind of journey on bringing forward a project like this?
Yeah, so the Mitcham scheme was built on land we purchased from the local authority. It was a former community centre which had been abandoned. So we were able to identify it as local authority lands. We dealt with a number of local authorities, and particularly in Merton, we found there was a real engagement to want to do something that was truly affordable, because it's 100% affordable, and that took some rethinking from the local authority. Because it was local authority land as well, there's an expectation around the red book value for the land. And we said, if you put the red book value for the land in, then that drives out the affordability of the scheme.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what we then need to do is to work with them in terms of how can we demonstrate added value? How can we demonstrate the value of the nominations that the local authority get through this scheme? So it's 50% nominations from local authority, 50% nominations from the YMCA. And that was able then to offset and provide a discount on the land. So we could buy the land at a cheaper price. The local authority were able to demonstrate that they discharged their duty, which then meant that the rents going to tenants was at the rate that was at those 65% of the market rent. So that was and that took a local authority that was wanted to be engaged, because it took extra thinking rather than going down the traditional processes. So Merton were a really good, engaged authority. The design in Mitcham was supposed to look like townhouses. So that was the idea around the pitch roofs and the street frontage to create that kind of look at townhouses. So there was adaptability in that, and the choice of colours as well. So I know some authorities don't like the brighter colours, but actually that was a local choice. So that was informed in terms of the cladding and the exterior look. There's flexibility, as you can see from the Parkview scheme as well. The scheme in Mitcham was very much a collaboration with the local planning and regeneration team. From a provider's perspective as well, there was a really good collaboration with the end user, and we were able to take, I know both in Romford and in Mitcham, residents who were going to live in those homes, they were able to go and visit the factory and see what was happening, and seeing the prototype unit, giving their feedback, which you can't do in a traditional setting. Actually, every time I open the door, it bangs into this. So actually, there was a real engagement with the end user as well, that collaboration in terms of how can we make this better for the person who's going to live there.
Fantastic. What are the outcomes? Most of the residents have stayed in place by the sound of it, so it hasn't been particularly high turnover in that time?
No, I think it's just the turnover tends to come now when people have that change of life circumstance. They have a partner, they have a family, they're moving away for work. So in terms of resident satisfaction, it's a very low demanding scheme in terms of we have a manager who lives there a few hours a week, but the scheme just looks after itself. It still looks good. It's still really valued by the people who live there. And it's right in the middle of a residential area, and the people in the local community are very happy with it.
Fantastic. Thank you both for your time. Really good deep dive into these two excellent trailblazing projects. Thanks.
Cheers,
Bye.
bye.
Cheers off. Bye.
For this session, I'm really pleased to be joined by James from Lewisham, Michelle Young from Tower Hamlets, and Roberto, a colleague who's been supporting Tower Hamlets with their modular delivery. We're going to have this session to talk about some of the lessons learned and experience from local authorities who've been delivering using MMC and Modular, but haven't necessarily had the easiest journey, and where there are lessons that could be helpful for other local authorities and delivery partners who are looking at Modular for the first time. James, please can you start us off?
Hi everyone. So James Ringwood, I work in the strategic housing development team at Lewisham, and we had quite a lot of experience of Modular. Many people in London are familiar with the Place project in Ladywell, which is a modular scheme, demountable modular scheme, or at least that's what the original intention of the project was, to provide temporary accommodation, 24 units temporary accommodation, as well as some ground floor commercial space. It won multiple awards and it has been a success. However, there are lessons to be learned. The original project was for it to be demountable. So to use it as a temporary basis and it had temporary planning permission, which was extended to be moved from site to site, pending full regeneration or full plans coming together for a particular site. We haven't moved it to another location. When we looked to where we would move it to, we were struggling to find a suitable site in which to do it. And the costs which were thought at the beginning of the project were woefully underestimated. Partly because, like I say, it's quite innovative at the time and it hadn't been tested. For me, a lesson learned on this is demountable needs a lot of thought, particularly if you're going to do it on a borough basis. I would strongly suggest that anyone that's considering a similar kind of scheme really comes and talks to us and considers what that pipeline might look like and what does that actually mean in terms of costs and groundworks and planning. Part of the demountable element of it and putting it on a new site is, of course, every time you get a new planning application, it needs to meet current building regulations. The Grenfell tragedy had a massive impact on costings for all of us. We know that across all of our stock, but particularly here, it was obviously not foreseen. You can clearly see that there's cladding on the building and there's new fire regulation came into place, rightly so, but that has had a big impact on a place, Ladywell. Demountable and lifetime, I think, are two things that we really should consider in much more detail. These are bespoke buildings. They are not what our in-house operatives are used to in the kind of normal housing stock. From a maintenance point of perspective, there needs to be an understanding of how you are going to source parts, how you're going to source operatives that understand how these buildings are put together. And I think, again, that's probably something that is a lesson learned for us. And that is not being disrespectful at all to our operatives. The ongoing maintenance and making sure that the skills are there, skills and knowledge of how the building is constructed and how it needs to be maintained, rather than temporary planning permission or a temporary site, much longer period of time, simply because of the cost associated with going through planning, the cost associated with groundwork, the cost associated with upgrades.
I guess one aspect was the fact that because it was a project of 4 stories high, the scheme had lifts, and as part of a demounting strategy, you need to work out how those lifts are going to come with the building. And if they're built in concrete, that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, and you're right. There are examples of modular units that have been dismantled 15 years after the first installation. And other than bringing them up to date in terms of building control regulations, they have worked quite well. There's one that's been done in Ealing. But if you're going to put something down like this, it has to be there for quite a while for it to be paid back. The foundations are probably 20% of the overall cost.
Yeah.
So there is a huge injection of cash for a site there in 7 years nothing else will happen to it.
Unless you can use those foundations again. And I guess that's coming back to that planning perspective of if you're going to reuse a building and a site in the future. And to James's point, you've got to do a lot more thinking in advance to work out where do the modules go, how do they come apart, are the foundations then wasted, are they used again? Because otherwise you're creating yourself challenges for the future as you try and unpick what was done on a meanwhile basis.
Yeah, in that you introduce in a level of complexity that if you have not done this before, but I think we can only encourage people to do it with their eyes wide open, because otherwise, and I speak more in terms of being able to do this over and over again. The problem with experiments is that if they're not perfect, no one ever does them again.
Absolutely. Everybody's trying it for the first time.
I've seen some example of traditional build in the recent months where I thought, actually, if done properly, it would not occur in modular. The building regulations control and assurance in modular, if inspections are carried out in the manner that they should be.
Which means in the factory, presumably,
yes,
you need to get...
Because you know, fire, thermal, water penetration, those are not difficult things to look at and consider when you are inspecting in a factory. So within a controlled environment, you are able to have all of your testing done before they arrive on site. But you need that process again about how all of that occurs, and the design upfront and the testing and evidence upfront before you enter manufacturing is key.
I just thought I'd jump in on that point, Roberta. I just wondered if building control inspectors are getting used to modular. Is that an area that needs more support and more upskilling and education? And likewise with planning teams as well, in terms of considering modular and understanding how it works.
I spoke with Tracy Curley, the Chief Executive of Ashford Council, and she was sharing the same experience in terms of they use specialist building control on one of their modular projects because they needed to find the right people with the right experience. But there was also a desire that the internal council's building control capability was brought up to speed so that they could do more of that themselves in the future.
Yeah, certainly from a building control aspect, the private or non-local authority building control, there is considerably more experience. I found out in one particular council, their concern wasn't necessarily the technical expertise, was being able to go and inspect off-site. I don't think there is a particular challenge within the local authority sector because building control within local authorities is pretty strong. We use, for example, at Place Limited, we used external building control only because we were meant to be working across a number of boroughs. So we couldn't have 6 building control all having their own inspection, but just a singular one. But that was purely a practicality. If you're working within one, I think is to build up those expertise in building control. I think the earlier they're involved, the better. And I think the learning process can be brought up to speed by the time it is delivered. I think the expertise is potentially slightly overblown when people want to go outside.
James, do you have a perspective on building control and getting those approvals?
Within Lewisham, we do like our internal team to do it. It just feels like there's a bit more control over it. I think the point that Michelle makes around upskilling within the council and council teams would probably be our preference. To Roberto's point around there being private companies out there that are experienced in this. If you upskill your teams internally and one project comes through in a 10-year period, then that's probably not the best investment. I think it depends on how authority wants to deal with modular. Is it on scale? And if it is, then the investment within the internal building control would be Lewisham's preference.
So I need to draw the conversation to a close. I've been really grateful for your contributions. If there was one final point of recommendation or advice you would give to local authorities looking at delivering modular for the first time, what would that be?
I would say there is a huge, huge benefit about the manufacturing in a safe environment. If done properly, it is quicker and you have better buildings than traditional.
I think it's the long-term vision for the project. You need to be considering this as a long-term solution and buildings remaining in place for a long period of time.
I'm looking at this from the point of view of material waste, and the MMC approach is really going to be able to deliver on that much better than anything else. So when you're looking at circularity and efficiencies, then this is the way to do it, isn't it?
Excellent. Thank you all very much for your time. I'm sure a lot of local authorities would be grateful for it because I think it clarifies they're not just being greenwashed or modular washed, to create a new word, that projects have their challenges, but through collaboration and experience, you get there in the end.
Thank you.
That's good.
Brilliant. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you for everybody who contributed to the session today. We're now going to move towards a Q&A. I think one of the first questions was related to temporary accommodation. And I think there was perhaps some confusion around temporary for the person versus temporary for the building, by which I mean meanwhile use buildings. Richard Birch, could I get you to comment on what we support there?
Yeah, so in terms of the LAS funding, because the LAS funding is delivering a long-term social affordable housing asset, we are looking for the examples of MMC, such as in the presentations that we've seen, which are those longer term assets. So yes, it's for those temporary, is for people who are homeless. So it's kind of temporary accommodation rather than kind of long-term tenancies, but the buildings themselves have that kind of long-term use. And eventually, once the kind of need for the uses, temporary accommodation is over, they can move into stock of affordable housing. for councils and RPs.
Thanks, Richard. Much appreciated. Now, if my colleague Michael Wilson could join, that would be great, because it'd be good to pick up the questions that were raised around the timeline of the residual CME programme. That's the continuous market engagement element of the affordable housing programme. And then there was a second element, which was to do with some of the accreditations, the BOPAS, the NHBC accepts, and how the affordable housing programme looks at that. So over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So the question around time frame. So the additional funding that was confirmed in the budget in October, so 500 million split between Homes England and the GLA. That funding predominantly is for schemes that can deliver by the original programme long stop date of March 2026. There's potentially very limited scope for delivery beyond that point, but that would be, as I mentioned, for schemes that have a kind of key strategic importance. And also worth mentioning that the government's announcement confirmed that there will be a new programme that's going to be announced in the spring budget, which will then be longer term funding.
Fantastic. And on the technical side of the programme, what we support and look for in MMC?
Yeah. So there's an expectation that for new build homes that the longevity of the property will last for minimum 60 years. And there's an expectation that those homes will be accredited by an appropriate body. So BOPAS is one, NHBC accepts could be another. We don't specify necessarily, but as long as those homes have been accredited, that's fine, that's supportable.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So there were some questions around procurement frameworks. There are a number of different procurement frameworks out there that offer a range of MMC solutions. So not just modular, but also panelised, depending on the height and the scale of those buildings. Homes England doesn't look to any particular one. There are a number out there, and different market participants prefer different ones, and different manufacturers are represented on different frameworks. So again, back to the theme of some of the recommendations from the talk is you've got to do your due diligence and go out there and meet the market and understand those supply chain and visit the manufacturers wherever possible, because it's really good to understand what those manufacturers specialize in and how that aligns with your project and what you're trying to achieve. There was a comment I was going to pick up, which I think came from Cornwall Council, that was about some of the barriers and some of the risks of offsite. And it's a really, really fair question. Clearly, the whole construction industry has been challenged with the high inflation, higher interest rates recently, as well as impacted viability and funding availability. The latest stats that I saw was over 11,000 companies have gone bust since 2021. That's over 100,000 workers in the construction sector that were impacted by them. The rolling average is just under about 3,400 companies a year, mainly SME contractors. And MMC and the modular factories are part of that, to be honest. They do grab a few more headlines than the rest of the sector. I was talking to a local authority last week who'd had 3 contractors go bust, traditional contractors, on a single project. Needless to say that they were pulling their hair out, trying to work out where they go next and how they manage that risk going forward. So it's a particularly challenging marketplace. And there's a question of how do you design those buildings so there's a bit of resilience, so that you're not beholden to an individual supplier, and there's a bit of flexibility that if something does unfortunately happen, you're able to find an alternative supplier to step in to those projects. Somebody's put in the framework, the 7 categories of MMC. Homes England supports all 7 categories, all types of MMC. We do look under the affordable housing towards category 1, so volumetric modular, and category 2, panelised, particularly closed panelised, where you've got insulation linings, sometimes windows, sometimes facades on the side of those panels. We look to those particularly because they embody more of the policy benefits that we're looking to achieve: the speed, the quality, the sustainability, the safety achieved through that factory-led enhancement. But there's a really wide scope, and much of the industry, particularly in London, is doing bathroom pods and M&E pods. So all the categories of MMC have a contribution to make. What is the view on imported modular homes, so modular homes from overseas? Much of the supply chain in the construction industry is overseas. So there's really elements of what are you talking about? It's either building materials, building components, or you put those components together and you've got a modular or volumetric building. So Homes England is agnostic. Clearly, we like to support domestic supply chains and industry. But there have been projects in Bristol. There was an affordable housing project where the delivery partner chose to use a manufacturer from Estonia. That was their decision. That manufacturer had also delivered projects in Sweden and had a very good reputation. They had all the necessary accreditations and met all the requirements. And that's okay with us. There's a project in Wales at the moment that's being delivered by a modular manufacturer out of Netherlands. Again, they understand our rules and requirements, and they've got supply chain and contracting partners in the UK that they collaborate with. And that's part of the mix and provides greater choice as well. Okay, so I think that was all the questions. I'm happy to come back to anybody else who wants to contact me if they've got any other questions. Thank you very much to all the participants and for everybody for joining and watching. Very grateful for your time. Thank you.